Welcome to the podcast, Amazing Tales from Off and On Connecticut's Beaten Path. And I'm your host, Mike Allen. You know, we take it for granted these days. You get an infection, you take an antibiotic, and poof, magic, the infection goes away. Well, not many people know that story began here in Connecticut, and that the first U.S. citizen to ever receive the first dose of life-saving penicillin was a Connecticut woman named Ann Miller. And this took place at Yale New Haven Hospital. And frankly, the story is nothing short of a miracle. Well, our guest today knows that story quite well. Dr. Richard Martinello is a senior physician and director of infection prevention at Yale New Haven Hospital. That's something, of course, in which we all have a vested interest. Not only will he have this story, but he'll delve into the shaky ground on which the entire antibiotic field is currently precariously perched. First, this week's trivia question. When a grave in eastern Connecticut was dug up a number of years ago and the bones that were found were arranged in a very peculiar way, what was it that they thought they had stumbled upon? Well, stick around after the main program for the answer, because then you'll know the topic for next week's show. Amazing Tales from Off and On Connecticut's Beaten Path is brought to you by our sponsor, Yale New Haven Health. Yale New Haven Hospital was the very first hospital in Connecticut. They opened their doors 200 years ago and later introduced the entire country to the use of penicillin and chemotherapy. Today, some of the brightest minds in medicine choose to work there, and it's the primary teaching hospital for the prestigious Yale School of Medicine. For more information, log on to ynhhs.org. That's ynhhs.org. Okay, so you just heard that advertisement for Yale New Haven Health, and yes, this episode is about a miracle that occurred at their facility about 80 years ago with the first use of the drug penicillin in the United States. Now, I believe that anybody who's listened to even one of my podcasts would probably understand completely that I'm not doing this to hype my sponsor, Yale New Haven Health, because quite frankly, they don't need any hyping. They're good enough as it is. But for the record, I want to state that I approached them to do this story, not the other way around. And I did try to get an interview with the family descendants of the person who had been treated, but that didn't work out. So I have no qualms about doing this episode, and I hope you don't either. It's simply an amazing story, part of our collective history, and yeah, it just happened to happen at the facility that sponsors this podcast. Well, enough said about that. Ann Miller lived in New Haven at the time that she got sick, very ill, and she was married to a Yale University administrator. Now, it wasn't because of any connections that her husband had that she got any sort of special treatment. In fact, just wait until you hear how this miracle came about. It's one of the most incredible stories I think you'll ever hear. Our guest today is Dr. Richard Martinello, who goes by Rick. He's both a senior physician as well as the director of infection prevention for Yale New Haven Health. Rick, let's start off talking about you. You are a specialist in infectious diseases, and here we are talking in the year 2023, and it's, I'm thinking, almost impossible to dial back 100 years. I'm sure you've done this a million times, but I'd love you to share this with our audience. What it was like before we had things like sulfa drugs or antibiotics or penicillin. When somebody came in with an infection, what was the protocol? What did you do?
Well, they would provide what we would today call supportive care, meaning that they would help make sure the patient was hydrated, that they were feeling as comfortable as possible. If there was a surgical solution, they would take advantage of that. But beyond that, it was really time that was primarily used to help treat these infections. As you can imagine, the outcomes were not even near to what we see today. Today we're very lucky to really have these miracle drugs in some way available to us, and oftentimes so safe and easy for us to use. It's hard to think back to what it was like in that pre-antibiotic era. But something we should touch on, though, is how we are now heading back, per se, into a pre-antibiotic era where we're seeing just increasing amounts of resistance. The bacteria, the funguses that we see causing human infections, are increasingly becoming resistant to these drugs. And we see fewer and fewer drugs, unfortunately, new antibiotics coming to market and becoming available for our physicians to use. And so we do have occasion now where we see patients where we do not have any good antibiotic options to treat them. And we are managing these patients in a way that, in some respects, is similar to what we would have seen 100 years ago.
Can you summarize what is the hurdle, what is the roadblock, but what is it, just more research money, or what's the next hurdle?
It does ultimately come down to money and to political will. And antibiotics are not big money makers. Typically, patients who are benefited by antibiotics only need to take those antibiotics for a short period of time. Sometimes our longer courses of antibiotics may only be 6 or 8 weeks. And you can imagine how, for a pharmaceutical company, they would benefit much more from selling drugs that our patients need to use on a daily basis for years on end, compared with antibiotics, which may be used for very short periods of time. And so in our current kind of economic and healthcare system, we don't really have the right incentives that are available to pharmaceutical companies and to our physicians to provide positive incentives for them to develop new antibiotics.
One of the reasons I wanted to spend some time doing that is because it leads right into the story of what happened at Yale New Haven Health, we're talking 80 to 100 years ago, and why this is so important. And we're going to talk now about Ann Miller. And ironically, now here's a woman who was born in New York City. She ends up moving to Connecticut and marrying a guy named Ogden Miller, who just happens to be the athletic director at Yale. And she had gotten her nursing degree at Columbia School of Nursing. So she, ironically, kind of understood what was happening to her when she had a miscarriage. She ended up with an infection, a blood poisoning type of infection that was oftentimes fatal. Just if you could describe what happened when she was admitted in 1942 for that month that she was there before anything happened. What kind of condition was she in?
So she was really in critical condition. Back at that time, 1942, we did not have intensive care units like we do today. My suspicion is, from seeing what her condition was like, was that we would have her in an intensive care unit now. But as you were saying, she was sick for a prolonged period of time. It was strep bacteria that was in her bloodstream. This is the type of infection that we see clinically worsening over hours and certainly over days, really requiring rapid medical attention and antibiotics, frankly, to help resolve that infection. And even in this day and age, when we see patients with this type of infection, sometimes they do not come to our care and do not get antibiotics early enough, and we still see bad outcomes. With Ms. Miller, it was really fascinating to see, and this gets back to the issue of what things were like during this pre-antibiotic era. Despite her having this really critical health condition, streptococcal bacteria in her bloodstream, she hung on for 4 weeks. And during those 4 weeks, her immune system, her body was really trying to fight off this infection as best possible. But there was this stalemate, and she remained with a persistent infection, and her fevers actually were typically in the 105, 106 range as it was measured at that time. So she was critically ill, 4 weeks in the hospital, and there was little else that they had to provide her at that point.
Now, before we get into the miracle that occurred, let's go over to England, where this whole thing started. And it was a Scottish biologist by the name of Sir Alexander Fleming. He got the Sir title later after all this happened to him. He went on a summer vacation, right? And he came back to his lab. And could you explain what was it that he found?
Alexander Fleming was a scientist who was very interested in bacteriology, and he, in fact, was studying bacteria and what was able to kill bacteria. He had actually been working on and made some real significant discoveries in this area over the preceding years. And his interest in this area is really spurred on by his experiences in World War I and some of the devastating infections related to the traumas that soldiers would experience during the war. And so he really had a very prepared mind to start off with. But what had happened was during the summertime, it was actually, I believe it was August, September 1928, he had gone on vacation. It was a 5-week vacation. And when he returned to his laboratory, he was, I suppose, cleaning up some of what he had left when he went on vacation. And what he had found was a petri dish where he was at one point growing some Staph aureus. And what he had found was that during his time away, that petri dish had become contaminated by a mold. And what he had observed was that mold actually had an area of clearing around it. What I mean by that is, while there was also this staphylococcal bacteria growing on this plate, that bacteria was no longer growing near the mold. So he had surmised that the mold was producing something that was killing off this bacteria. And so it was a real, critical observation that he made. With his scientific mind, he was able to recognize that this observation was really important and to follow up on that observation.
Now, as I heard the story, he just didn't have the funding. It would take almost another decade until he teamed up with a couple of gentlemen from Oxford University, one of them an Australian, Howard Florey, and then another guy, Ernest Chain. And the three of them started experimenting it again. They were trying to do something to help out with what was quickly developing into World War II in 1941. The bombing of London made it very difficult for them to continue their work there. But before they transferred their work away from the bombing over to the United States, they managed to treat, as I understand it, 6 patients, 4 of whom were saved, and 2 of whom died, but really only because they ran out of the substance, which turned out to be penicillin, that they were making there. And so then, with the bombing by the Germans of London, they had to sort of give up the ghost and turn it over to the U.S. And Howard Florey himself came over and met another guy from Yale named John Fulton. Can you explain that relationship and what happened and where it went from there?
Through this work, Fulton and Florey became good friends, so much to the extent that during the height of the war, with Fulton, living here in the New Haven area, Howard Florey, living in London at the time, had actually sent his children to New Haven to live for the war years to help keep his children safe, furthering the relationship of the two. And that turned out to be a really critical relationship because it was through that connection between Dr. Fulton here in New Haven, Howard Florey, who was involved with the development of penicillin, that the connection was able to be made that allowed penicillin to come to New Haven to be used for Ann Miller's treatment.
Now, the way that connection was made is dramatic, it's unbelievable, and it's just a great part of this story. So it turns out that John Fulton, the doctor, himself gets sick at the same time that Ann Miller gets sick, and they are being treated by the same doctor at Yale New Haven, Dr. John Bumstead. Can you explain what happened then?
Dr. Bumstead was familiar with some of the work that was being done in the development of these early antibiotics. I believe it was the Saturday Evening Post that he was reading that described some of the work that was being done on the development of sulfa antibiotics and the potential for other antibiotics. And he was aware that one of the critical people involved in this scientific research was Howard Florey. And Bumstead was also aware that John Fulton, who was hospitalized at the same time as Ann Miller, he was friendly with Howard Florey. And so when Fulton was hospitalized, Bumstead was also caring for Ann Miller, and he was very frustrated by the lack of progress that Ms. Miller was making, frustrated by the lack of options that he had to provide for the treatment of Ann Miller. And so he started to discuss that with John Fulton, and specifically was asking Fulton about some of Howard Florey's work. And it was through that connection that they were able to then communicate and make penicillin available here in New Haven for the treatment of Ann Miller.
Now, Bumstead actually asked Fulton to pick up a phone and make some calls on behalf of this whole attempt to get penicillin to treat Ann Miller, correct?
Absolutely. Fulton was able to make that phone call on a Thursday. And what is really remarkable, and it's important to remember that this was in 1942. It's at the height of World War II, if you will. And he was able to get penicillin, which was being produced, I believe it was New Jersey, perhaps Washington, D.C., and get penicillin flown up to New Haven for Ann Miller's use. He had made that phone call on a Thursday afternoon, and by Saturday, penicillin had arrived in New Haven.
Now, the other thing that is just mind-boggling about this was he managed to get half of the entire supply of penicillin that was in the U.S. at that time and have it sent there in 2 days. But the remarkable part is just how much half of the supply was. Can you explain that?
Yeah, half of the supply, as I understand it, was about 5 grams. This is a very small amount of penicillin. And I think one of the important things at that time was there was very limited use in humans. Most of the use was actually in mice at this point, and they really didn't understand how much to use, how it should be dosed. And so a lot of it was just their best thoughts on how to provide this medication to Ms. Miller.
Now, for people like me who are challenged between weight and volume, the 5 grams comes out to about a tablespoon. And so this is a miraculously small amount of fluid. And like you say, they didn't know how much to administer, how often to administer it, because they hadn't done it on humans in the United States. So they end up administering it to her through, an IV starting Saturday afternoon. And what happened then?
Well, and that's where the real remarkable change occurred, because her infusion was started about 3:30 in the afternoon here in New Haven on Saturday. And by Sunday, her fever had actually resolved for the first time in 4 weeks. And by the following day, by Monday, she was doing better. She was eating again. And they noticed that some of her laboratory values by that point were already starting to improve.
So now put this in perspective. You, in your role as the infectious disease specialist at Yale New Haven, and you know what it did to save so many lives in World War II. It still took a long time to make it available, and this goes back to what we started talking about originally, was somebody then had to make the investment to actually make penicillin.
It's even a little more complicated because at that time, while they did have sulfa antibiotics that were available, there were some failures the few times that sulfa drugs were being used. And so there wasn't a great deal of confidence or enthusiasm that antibiotics would actually turn out to be useful for the care of people with infections. And so that was some of the resistance, if you will, to their development. Of course, with World War II underway, and the real need for the aggressive ability to be able to successfully treat infections was clear. So there was some additional investment at that time, but there was a lot of uncertainty about whether or not it was going to really pan out. And so Ms. Miller's case was critically important to really spur on further development because her condition was so dire and the success in her treatment was so rapid that it really provided, I think, the confidence that was necessary to demonstrate that antibiotics could truly be life-saving medications.
You're so right on that. And yet, I read somewhere that in 1943, a year after she was discharged, they still had only been able to make enough penicillin to treat 30 people. So this is just kind of tells you what it was like.
Yeah, it really took some time to ramp up the ability to develop and make these drugs more widely available. Something that was actually commonplace early on, in fact, occurred with Ms. Miller, is they knew that some of the penicillin that persons received would be excreted in its active condition into the urine. And so they would actually collect that urine and extract the unused, per se, penicillin out of the urine so it could be again purified and potentially used in other people. And that practice went on for some time because it was so difficult to make sufficient volumes of penicillin to treat the number of people who could benefit from it.
So, to kind of humanize this, I think a lot of people look at doctors and put you on pedestals, rightly so, with your knowledge base. But you're human beings too. You go to cocktail parties and whatnot. And I've got to believe that you tell this story to people at parties all the time because it's just so remarkable.
Yeah, that could be. That could be. It is, such a remarkable story, but also it really makes me reflect on how critical these drugs are to our modern healthcare. And, beyond just our typical patient who comes in, with an infection, I think it's really important to recognize that it is with antibiotics and their successes that we're able to do much of the surgeries that we can do today. We routinely give patients undergoing major surgeries antibiotics to help keep them from getting infections related to the surgery and to ensure that those surgeries are successful. And then, of course, we have patients undergoing treatments for cancer, patients who are immunosuppressed because they've had an organ transplant or a bone marrow transplant. And all of these patients require antibiotics to help keep those infections away or to treat those infections if they do get one. And without antibiotics, what we see with medicine and our capabilities in medicine today would be much more limited than what we have available to us. In 1945, when Alexander Fleming received the Nobel Prize for his discovery of penicillin, something that he actually said at that time was he expressed concern about the possibility of bacteria becoming resistant to antibiotics. And he said it right at the tail end of his speech when he was receiving this award. And it was such an important comment because, now today, this is something that we really struggle with and, needs to be, very much addressed within our society and how we use these life-saving medications.
Well, that wraps up this episode of Amazing Tales from Off and On Connecticut's Beaten Path. Ann Miller went on to live in Washington, Connecticut in Litchfield County after her husband became headmaster of the gunnery school there. In fact, she outlived him and would live another 57 years, finally passing away in 1999 at the ripe age of 90. I really want to thank our guest for today's program, Dr. Richard Martinello, Senior Physician at Yale New Haven Health and Director of Infection Prevention for their network. The answer to this week's trivia question, the question was, when a grave in eastern Connecticut was dug up a number of years ago and the bones that were found there were arranged in a very peculiar way, what was it that officials thought they had stumbled upon? Well, the answer is a vampire grave. Yes, there were allegations that a vampire had been unearthed. Next week on Amazing Tales CT, we'll have this unusual story for you, including with the official who oversaw the case and was there when the digging occurred. Amazing Tales from Off and On Connecticut's Beaten Path is a production of True North Associates, LLC. This is Mike Allen. Be safe and please stay healthy.